From London, this is The Standard podcast, and I'm Mark Blunden. Coming up, it's Fabric's 25th anniversary. We speak with the author of a new book about the London superclub. But first, thousands of farmers converged on Westminster as tractors made a slow drive through central London on Wednesday afternoon in a second protest against Labour's inheritance tax reforms. Farmers travelled from across the country amid anger about the so-called tractor tax announced in October's budget, which will see farms with assets of over £1 million lose their exemption to inheritance tax. To discover more, the Standard podcast is joined by Simon Smith, a land agent and senior lecturer at the Royal Agricultural University in Cirencester. Please, could you give us an explainer of the causes behind the London protest today? What is the issue and what are the farmers in Westminster calling for?
Well, the core issue is that unexpectedly, and it wasn't mentioned in anyone's manifesto, the release for inheritance tax has been changed quite dramatically. And I think the first thing to remember is it's not just farmers. There are two reliefs which have been changed dramatically. One is called agricultural property relief and the other business property relief. And that applies, that business property relief, to all small family-owned businesses. So it might be a chap with a plumbing business in London, a heating business, a small shop, a corner shop. It's not just about farmers. It catches anyone who has a business.
And in terms of the inheritance tax, could you give us a reminder of what the government has said on this and how this is affecting the people at the protest and, as you explained, these groups more widely?
Well, for the last 30 years, if you've qualified for APR or BPR, as we call them, you've had 100% relief from inheritance tax. As from March 26, we are told, you will get £1 million worth of assets going through free, and the rest will be taxed at half the normal rate. And the trouble with farmland is, the average price for an acre, if there is such a thing as an average acre, is about £12,000. That level is driven by other things, people wanting to buy land for hobbies or whatever. It is very hard to pay the tax due every generation out of the income from farming. And so farming for since 1894 has had special treatment from the tax system. And that treatment has survived all different flavours of government, from a 1920s Labour administration right through to the post-war Labour administrations. They've all seen that because land is very high value but generates low income, it's quite hard to pay normal rate-based inheritance tax on it.
Okay, and in terms of those high values you mentioned, critics would say farmers have got a good deal with the inheritance tax and have, as some describe it, the broadest financial shoulders for this new tax burden. What's your view on this?
On paper, yes. They could always sell off land to pay the bill. But of course, if you start selling, part of your business premises, you reduce your ability to pay tax in the future. And also, the changes don't just affect land-owning farmers. There will be people who have tenanted farms. So the value of the land is irrelevant to them. But their machinery, they may have invested in new grain drying equipment. All that is now subject to inheritance tax in a way it wasn't earlier in the year. That's why it's important, because it's not just the farming side, it's the business side. And there are plenty of farming types who don't own land, but who have a lot of money tied up in equipment, kit, and who make investment decisions. And they will be affected too.
In terms of food supply, concerns that what does the winter hold in terms of these protests?
I'm not at all sure. I think the trouble with threatening to withhold food supplies is it's not very practicable, because if you're a milk producer, you need the income from selling milk to keep going. And there's a danger if you do start striking in that way or behaving like French farmers, you lose public goodwill.
What are your thoughts on if there's any appetite for remedy from the Starmer government? And do you think that this lobbying is going to have any sort of positive effect? Are you hopeful?
I think there is one option. There is a lot of worry that people are using this release to avoid inheritance tax by deliberately investing in business and farm property. There is a thing called conditionality, which happens for other tax reliefs. So I inherit my father's business, say. As long as I carry on trading, then the relief applies. If I decide to cash in and sell up, then the relief is removed. So they could explore looking at conditionality, which would enable businesses to carry on, but also would take away the opportunity for those people who are just using the release just to avoid tax.
Let's go to a quick break. Coming up in part 2, meet the author of a new book chronicling 25 years of the East London superclub, Fabric. If you're new here, please do make sure to hit follow and give us a rating. Welcome back. Fabric is celebrating its 25th anniversary with a new book about the superclub's emergence to the top of the capital's music scene. The venue, which is opposite Smithfield Market in Farringdon, became one of London's best-known spots for fans of genres from jungle to grime to house and techno. Now, the Standard podcast is joined by Joe Muggs, author of the book, which is called Fabric. It's published by White Rabbit and out now. Joe is a freelance writer and also a DJ. Please, could you paint us a picture of Fabric inside the club in its heyday and also now, and how would you describe its unique offering?
The wonderful thing about Fabric is that it's really difficult to talk about heyday because it just keeps on keeping on. It actually looks almost identical now to what it did in 1999. They've barely refurbished. When they have, it's generally been to spruce up the sound system. And so what you get is just an evolving picture of London's nightlife. On a Friday, it's always been broadly what they would call bass music. It's been breakbeat, drum and bass, grime, dubstep, all of that sort of thing. So a sort of slightly, maybe younger, slightly more multicultural, slightly more student perhaps crowd. Saturday is pure house and techno, always has been, for what they would say, is a serious party people crowd. And then Sundays has been the LGBTQ plus scene as it's evolved over the years for an even more serious party crowd.
And in terms of the attraction of the venue for these crowds, what keeps bringing people in what is a very crowded market in London?
Fabric has always been about the pure experience of the dance floor, nothing else. It was always, the founder Keith Riley used to do warehouse parties, so it was always about no frills, great sound system, a dance floor where you could always hear the sound system, the best DJs. Everything else is secondary to that, nice toilets, nice bars or whatever, but it is purely about the music. So it's a space for dancers above all else. That's it.
Why did you write the book, and could you talk us through your research process?
Well, I wrote it because they asked me, which was very, very nice. Of Fabric and White Rabbit books together came to me, but that's because I've got a name as a historian of subculture, basically, especially since my last big book, Bass Mids Tops. And my approach has always been people first. So it's all about talking to loads and loads and loads of people, getting the minutiae of their stories, getting how the music impacts on their actual everyday lives. And then the big picture just emerges from that. It's getting as many voices in as possible. So for this, I really spoke to, it was something like 200 DJs plus everyone who's worked for Fabric over the 25 years. And the story just comes from them. It's their story.
And who were some of the big names you interviewed?
It's from the top down. It's huge names like DJ Sasha and Nina Kravitz and Laurent Garnier and Carl Cox, right down to brand new DJs, because Fabric keeps nurturing new talent. Elijah from the grime scene was really insightful. JME from the grime scene, really insightful. All these people from dubstep and drum and bass and stuff. I loved hearing little anecdotes like Errol Alkan turning his night into a fundraiser for his favourite Greek restaurant around the corner where he used to take DJs for breakfast, or Cooley G, the bass house, Afro house DJ, referring to it as a sci-fi movie, and suddenly, the interior of it came to life in my head. These little anecdotes were really important.
And Joe, you mentioned that in terms of the minutiae of your interviews. Any surprising discoveries, any scoops or such that caused you to raise your eyebrows?
I'll tell you what, the actual foundation of Fabric, the financing behind it, the battles that went on behind the scenes, well, people thought it was all smooth running and all great party fun for the first 4 or 5 years, were eye-popping, and most of it, amazingly, has made it into the book through the legal processes. But there was some stuff about battles with one of the early investors that really made my wig fly off and spin round. I'm not going to tell you because you've got to read it, but it's really good.
Could you give us a hint?
This guy used to wear a cape like a vampire to meetings, and he was last seen heading off into a war zone on a barge. I mean, it's like you couldn't make it up type stuff.
But in 2016, it was forced to close following the deaths of 2 teenagers who tragically died after taking drugs at the venue, only to reopen several months later after a campaign and new licensing conditions. Obviously, amongst the light and celebration with Fabric, there's been some dark times as well. 2016, in your research, how did you find the club culture changed after it reopened?
Talking to all the staff, I mean, it was a real light and dark situation. The amount of support and love that had poured in for Fabric during the Save Fabric campaign really G'd people up and made them remember what an important cultural institution it was that they were running. But they were running under such serious strictures and with the eyes of the authorities very much on them. It was tough. It was a tough, really 4 years. And amazingly, weirdly, COVID gave them a breathing space, allowed them to just pause, think what they were all about, and relaunch as more of a cultural institution and actually be appreciated by the wider world as a cultural institution, working with St Paul's Cathedral and the ballet companies and stuff. So yeah, COVID became the reboot after that stressful period that they really needed.
And that's The Standard. For the latest news, head over to standard.co.uk. This podcast is back tomorrow at 4 p.m.